diet, not in the sense of losing weight, but in the sense of what people eat or human societies consume in order to sustain their nutritional needs. So in the concepts or terms that we're going to be focusing on in this video are going to be things that the factors that can influence food consumption, being level development, physical conditions, and cultural preferences, and then also looking at dietary energy consumption, or more commonly known as calories in our society, and then the primary source of these calories in the world today, cereal grains. So taking a look, getting right into it, why different foods in different regions? Why is it that we consume different foods? Well, the three ideas that I highlighted just a moment ago are at the core of it. Development is a huge factor, not only in the variety of foods we eat, but also the food sources that we eat. And this can vary drastically depending on where you are in the world. But generally speaking, the types of food we enjoy and eat are usually more processed, more further away from the natural sources than what we often see in developing countries. Also, the amount and the variety is significantly greater. Physical conditions. This is when we start looking at the more physical characteristics of geography, whether it's the climate, the natural landscape, is going to inherently impact what can be grown based on those conditions. It's just a reality that certain crops or certain food sources thrive in some conditions better than others. And depending on location, this can influence significantly the kinds of foods that humans or different populations will consume. The third one is cultural preferences. Looking at this is, can be influenced by a variety of factors, traditions, religion, cultural norms of a particular place. And but they can influence the types of foods that are eaten regardless of some of the factors that we looked at in the previous two, whether it's development or physical conditions. It could be a cultural or a religious, a cultural taboo or a religious belief not to eat a particular animal for some particular reason or a particular plant. But those cultural preferences can, again, drastically change, or what is accepted as common dietary intake. In certain parts of the world, for example, we might see rice, in particular in East Asia and Southeast Asia, where there are different types of rice that thrive in different climate conditions. We see this as a very common crop, more so in the Eastern Hemisphere more than the Western Hemisphere. Another one, as we look at throughout the world, in Africa, we see different grain crops. We see yams and millet and different grains, cereal grains. If we look at overall, the most commonly consumed grains in the world are wheat, corn, and rice. In fact, those three comprise over 90% of the overall commercial, food grains that are consumed or calories consumed in society. In fact, it's about 40% of all calories consumed today. Although, as we look at the consumption of food, calories, or the energy that's derived from the actual food that's being consumed. In America, we often just refer to them as calories, but if what we're looking at is what's actually called a kilocalorie, basically it reflects the amount of energy that's in 1 gram of a particular substance or food amount. And so when it's consumed, what is the value that it actually brings to human energy needs? And so when we look at through what we actually consume, the vast majority come from those cereal grains, in particular corn, wheat, and rice. And even though corn is actually the most produced food in the world, but it's not always for human consumption. It's actually produced often for the livestock, or it's used as a feed for animals that we ultimately do consume as meat. Which brings us to another concept as we start looking at the types of protein or foods that we eat. If we look at this global map, this chloropleth map, we can see where the source of energy, the primary source of energy coming from in terms of the cereal grains. And you'll notice that in the United States, it's wheat, and if we move in other places around the world, we start to see rice and and maize or corn in other parts of the world. Now, again, if we look at some of those other areas, we're going to find some other grain crops, or perhaps yams, or other high-calorie items. Another major factor of this is the protein. And this is, you hear about it from your parents in terms of a healthy, rounded diet, is to make sure you have, especially as growing young adults, is to have lots of protein. And we, in our society, or developed societies, tend to eat more meat, in particular beef. But it's because this is really a luxury on a global scale, because it takes an incredible amount of energy to bring livestock or meat to market, and because the animals need to consume it, and so that means food has to be grown for them to consume, to get to grow fat enough, or to become market worthy in terms of a meat product. It's a huge difference in between LDCs, lesser developed countries, and MDCs, or more developed countries, in the how we gain our protein. We tend to get a lot of it from meat, whereas in other places they rely on more on the grains and cereals as well. So as we look at another example of this, looking at a global scale, you can see that about a quarter of our nutrients, our protein, comes from meat, whereas if you look at other places around the world, it's more grain heavy. And you'll notice, based on the wealth, if you look at Western Europe, North America, Australia, these are all more examples of wealthier parts of the world, with a couple of exceptions in South America, but also those are very significant beef producing states. If we look at now looking at this specifically by protein as a percentage, again, you can see this pattern playing out. And in a few exception areas, you'll notice that it's higher than, and even though they're not developed countries, if you look at, for example, Mongolia, but again, those are in the highlands of the Asian plateaus, where agriculture is not very sustainable. So you have a lot of nomadic populations that rely on herds that they are domesticated and then consume for their source of foods. So hopefully that helps clarify or illustrate some of these major factors of consumption. And we look at the level of development, physical care conditions, and cultural preferences. We'll look more at that as we get into the culture unit. And then the major crops that we find being consumed.